What happens to a knight who no longer has a kingdom to protect, or a people who no longer believe in dragons? Welcome to the second video in this series on St. George, patron saint of England. It's been a whole year since the first one, and if you've stuck around, thank you. I hope it proves worth the wait. Now that I've finally dusted off the notes and finished the script, let's dive in. In part 1, we explored how St. George became a vital part of the English identity, from early Christian martyr to a dragon-slaying knight and national hero. We saw how his image resonated through every layer of society, and how, by the close of the medieval period, he'd become one of the most exalted figures in Christian England. But how does a saint, once revered in prayer and celebrated in procession, slip into obscurity until even his name, let alone his feast day, becomes little more than a forgotten relic? In this video, we'll trace the long shadow of his decline. This is the story of the fall of St. George. To grasp just how far St. George's cultural influence once reached, at the peak of his devotion, his feast day was almost on par with Christmas. Imagine December the 25th just vanishing from the calendar, and you begin to understand the extent of what we may have lost. At the height of his fame, following the appearance of the Knightly Order of the Garter and through victories like Agincourt in the reign of Henry V, his image as the dragon-slaying knight resonated with nobles and commoners alike. But even then, the seeds of his decline had already been sown. Despite his martial glory, George was still, at his core, a saint and a martyr, deeply tied to Catholic devotion. And while that was at first a source of his strength, soon it would become a liability in a country where the religious ground was beginning to shift. Long before the Reformation fractured the English church, cracks were already beginning to form. Even in his glory days, not everyone was convinced by the cult of St. George. Before our patron saint rose to national prominence, England had several contenders vying for the role of heavenly protector. One of the most prominent rivals was St. Edmund, a martyr king killed during a Viking raid around 869. His burial site at Bury St. Edmunds became a major pilgrimage destination, especially after the founding of an influential abbey in the town that would in time house Edmund's relics. By the 12th century, St. Edmund's feast day was widely observed across England, not just in his native East Anglia. Some liturgical calendars even ranked him above Edward the Confessor, reflecting his high position in England's spiritual hierarchy. Kings like Canute showered the abbey with gifts, and even Edward I made pilgrimage there in 1290, further reinforcing St. Edmund's national importance. The case for Edmund was clear. England needed a protector. Abbey records and medieval hagiographies tell tales of him defending towns and punishing enemies, building a lasting reputation as a spiritual guardian of the realm, a king who would not renounce his faith, even when faced with certain death. Medieval chroniclers like Abbo of Fleury, Roger of Wendover, and Matthew Paris portrayed him as a martyr king who stood firm against pagan invaders, a defender of Christian England, willing to sacrifice himself rather than betray his God or his people. At the same time, another powerful figure stood in the wings, St. Michael the Archangel. Not just a saint, but heaven's greatest warrior, leader of the angelic host, and the one who, according to Revelation, cast Satan down from heaven. We've already seen the uncanny similarity between his depictions standing over a defeated Satan and those of St. George's triumph over a different serpent. This overlap of saintly imagery suggests a kind of cross-pollination over time, as myths representing similar ideas and archetypes intertwined. St. Michael's cult had a strong presence in England, especially in the West, at sacred sites like St. Michael's Mount in Cornwall and Glastonbury Abbey. Like George, he was a warrior, but of a different order. While George was a knight of the earthly realms, Michael was a captain of heaven, a divine protector, invoked not only in times of battle, but at moments of personal and cosmic judgment. And in an age when warfare was a constant threat, the celestial authority he brought with him offered reassurance, a heavenly ally against earthly foes. St. George's following also began regionally. As shown in the Chronicles of the Garter, his following was strongest in the south and west of England, but it gained significant momentum in the 14th century under Edward III. This marked a turning point, as St. George's legend and imagery were embraced by the monarchy and mobilised by the king's knightly order to inspire pride and national unity. but even then his rise was not without resistance. Despite the crown's push for a unifying symbol, a host of regional saints still retained deep roots, and his adoption wasn't uniform across the country. St Cuthbert held sway in Northumbria, St Thomas Becket remained a powerful presence in Canterbury, and even St Nicholas, whose feast on the 6th of December was widely celebrated throughout Europe, had churches dedicated to him across England. It's clear then that St George didn't rise to the top unchallenged. He had to fight his way there. But beyond regional rivalry, the far greater threat would come not from fellow saints, but from a deeper, more existential crisis, the large-scale questioning of the very foundations of faith. As we noted in the previous video, under Henry V, England enjoyed a period of military success, with St George firmly at the helm, and by this time the popular image of the saint had begun to change as he became more closely aligned with royal authority and military identity. The subsequent succession of Henry VI continued to feed into this change, but his reign was plagued by political instability, culminating in the Wars of the Roses, a long struggle for the throne between the houses of Lancaster and York. As the monarchy's religious and cultural influence weakened, so too did its focus on promoting England's patron saint. Christian cults, saints' festivals and pilgrimages began to lose much of the unifying power they once had, overshadowed by more immediate concerns. Survival in the face of unstable leadership, political divisions, and growing civil unrest became the more pressing issues of the day. And in this climate, the saint's spiritual hold over the people started to show its first signs of waning. As political unity fractured and royal authority weakened, so too did the cultural and religious structures that once upheld national symbols like St George. The cracks weren't just social or political though, they were theological and intellectual, and alongside the competition for the title of England's patron saint, St George came under increasing scrutiny from scholars and theologians. Scepticism about the truth of his origins had long been a factor, given the legendary and often fantastical nature of the stories surrounding him. Notably, the 14th century scholar and cleric John of Damascus cast doubt on the reliability of many saints' biographies, including George's, arguing that these narratives were allegorical, not factual, and created more for moral instruction rather than historical record. In fact, earlier thinkers had already raised broader concerns about the cult of saints. In his De Sacramentis, the 12th century monk Hugh of St Victor warned that excessive devotion to saints came with the risk of eclipsing the worship of God. Though these early critiques were scattered, they foreshadowed the more systematic challenges that would emerge in the centuries to come. By the late medieval period, critiques of saint veneration became more organised and more widespread. The Wycliffe movement, which emerged in the 14th century, called for a return to a purer scripture-based form of Christianity, and it directly challenged the role of saints in religious life. The Wycliffe Bible from 1382 deliberately omitted references to the cult of saints, including St George. This reflected a desire emerging within the church to reject tradition that didn't stem directly from gospel. The peak influence of this work came in the late 14th century, but its ideas persisted into the 15th, most notably through Wycliffe's followers, the Lollards. They rejected the notion of saints as mediators and advocated instead for a direct relationship with God. Despite being condemned as heretical by the broader church at the time, the Lollards' teachings gradually found a wider audience, and their critiques laid the intellectual and theological groundwork for the more sweeping rejections of the Reformation. English Protestantism increasingly diverged from Catholic doctrine as Lutheran and Calvinist ideas spread from the continent, especially those concerning the role of saints. For the cult of St George, this was devastating. Once seen as a major symbol of English spiritual life, he now came to represent an outdated form of religion, one that was increasingly at odds with the new theological landscape. By the late 15th century, while the cult of St George had weathered the storms of regional rivalry and critique from the fringes of the church, the ground beneath it was no longer as firm as it once was. The late medieval church faced mounting pressures not just from radical reformers like the Lollards, but also from more scholarly voices across Europe. In England, these intellectual undercurrents coincided with a fast-changing political landscape too, one that would bring the Tudors to power and reshape the religious future of the entire nation. Following Henry VII's victory over Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, the Tudor dynasty was established, signalling the fall of the Yorkist monarchy and the start of a new era in English history. This triumph ended the War of the Roses, symbolising unification of the two warring factions. To give weight to his claim and solidify his legitimacy, Henry adopted St George's cross and emblem, symbolising national unity under the Tudor banner. His marriage to Elizabeth of York further reconciled the rival houses, and at last brought political stability to the country after years of conflict. At the same time, as the power of the English crown grew, the authority of the Pope was increasingly put into question. Monarchs like Henry VII were becoming bold enough to foster a more nationalistic form of Christianity, one that relied less on papal influence. All of this allowed St George's image, at least in the guise of national hero, to align well within the evolving state of politics. But as the 15th century drew to a close, and with religious authority in flux, the growing influence of humanism began reshaping attitudes towards saint veneration, leaving the cult of saints, including St George, significantly weakened by the end of Henry's reign. While he maintained some traditional religious practices and continued the use of St George's image for royal and military purposes, Henry's focus during this period was more on political consolidation than strong spiritual leadership, and as such, his reign marked a subtle shift away from the connection between national identity and holy figures. By the late 15th century, humanism, an intellectual movement that emphasized classical learning and personal, Bible-centered faith, began to reshape English thought. Building on the momentum of the Lollards, figures like John Colet and Erasmus championed a return to a purer, scripture-based Christianity, promoting a direct relationship with God rather than relying on saintly go-betweens. Offering a more moderate alternative to the sweeping changes advocated by the Lollards, the humanists may have emphasised similar ideals, but they aimed to bring them about through gradual reform within the Church rather than via direct confrontation. We can see this approach in Erasmus's Encomium Moriae, The Praise of Folly, published in 1509. In this work, he satirised religious practices of the time, including the excessive veneration of saints. Although Erasmus didn't specifically target St George, his critique was part of a broader movement questioning traditional practices, ultimately setting the stage not only for the Protestant Reformation, but the eventual decline of saintly worship in England. While the approach of the humanists was intellectual and scholarly, with figures like Erasmus seeking to purify Christianity through education, the Reformation would take a much more confrontational path, quickly gaining momentum throughout Europe. By the early 16th century, Martin Luther's 95 Theses famously challenged the Pope's authority and the selling of indulgences, donations made to the Church in exchange for the remission of sins or for reducing time spent in purgatory. This practice, which many saw as essentially one big scam, became a major point of contention for reformers like Luther and John Calvin, who chose to reject the Catholic Church entirely. They pushed for a complete break, and they worked to establish new religious practices based strictly on their interpretations of the Bible. But for them, the goal went much deeper. With Catholicism so rooted in ceremony and tradition, they believed nothing short of total reform would be enough to ensure salvation. And so, they aimed to uproot the very foundations of Catholic doctrine. Meanwhile, in England, under Henry VIII and his son Edward VI, figures like William Tyndale and Thomas Cranmer embraced these more radical ideas, leading to the movement we now call the English Reformation. And with the stakes so high, the question loomed: what would become of England's saints? Few monarchs left quite a mark like the second Tudor king, Henry VIII. His time on the throne turned England upside down, and the religious changes he sparked would prove irreversible. In a move no English ruler had made before, Henry declared himself head of the Church, cutting ties with Rome and undermining the authority of Pope Clement VII. Part of this was personal. He wanted to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, but the moment was also shaped by something much bigger. A growing wave of Protestant thought, and the break from Rome laid the final foundations for the English Reformation. Saintly devotion didn't disappear overnight, but it did start to fade. As Henry leaned more and more on Protestant support, the veneration of saints began to decline across the country, gradually at first, but noticeably. One of the key turning points came in 1536, when Henry authorised his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, to issue a series of injunctions. These orders reduced the number of religious feast days, especially those that landed on weekdays. Cromwell called them superfluous holy days, targeting celebrations not found in scripture, or those thought to encourage idleness. Feasts that interrupted the agricultural calendar, like those during harvest time, were among the first to go. Most of the cuts hit lesser-known saints, or festivals considered superstitious. Pilgrimage, which had been a central part of English religious life, was also on the chopping block. Not only were pilgrimages now seen as theologically questionable, but they also involved large groups travelling for days or weeks. That made them both economically inconvenient for those in power and socially disruptive in the eyes of the ruling class. And the injunctions didn't stop there. They also reaffirmed Henry's control over the church and discouraged the veneration of relics and images. All that said, Henry was still politically savvy. He knew when to lean into tradition if it served his goals. So St. George's Day wasn't abolished. As England's patron saint, closely tied to the monarchy and the Order of the Garter, George held on to his place in the national calendar. Still, even he wasn't entirely safe. Many of his images were caught up in the wider crackdown on religious iconography. And while the injunctions didn't directly ban monasteries, the official dissolution of the monastic system did begin that same year, 1536. The process started with smaller monasteries, which Cromwell's commissioners often described as havens of superstition or corruption, accusing them of anything deemed inappropriate, like the misuse of relics. Again, another money-making grift in the eyes of the reformers. In the parts of the country where reformist ideas were strongest, sympathetic bishops began clearing out miracle-working statues, votive candles, and offerings to the saints. Even the shrine of Thomas Becket at Canterbury, once one of the most important pilgrimage destinations in all of England, came under increasing pressure. But for all its scale, Henry's religious revolution wasn't clean or consistent. Some dioceses enforced the new rules to the letter, whilst others barely changed at all. Local clergy and parishioners often resisted quietly, choosing to hide or preserve sacred images instead of destroying them outright. A subtle but powerful act of defiance. One of the most visible signs of this spirit of resistance came in the form of the Pilgrimage of Grace, a large-scale popular uprising in northern England that posed one of the most serious threats to Henry's reign. It began in the autumn of 1536, mainly in Yorkshire and other parts of northern England. At its core, it was a protest against the king's break with Rome, the dissolution of the monasteries, and the general upheaval caused by the Reformation up to this point. But it wasn't just about religion. People were also frustrated by rising taxes, poor harvests, and corruption among royal advisors, especially Thomas Cromwell, who many blamed for pushing the king too far. So, while the uprising was framed in religious terms, it also carried a heavy sentiment of political and economic unrest. Tens of thousands of people joined in, peasants, local gentry, monks, even some nobles. They marched under banners bearing the 5 wounds of Christ, a clear symbol of traditional Catholic devotion. They called their movement a pilgrimage to frame it not as a rebellion, but as a peaceful and godly protest aimed at restoring the true faith and long-standing tradition. The rebels actually managed to take control of several towns and strongholds along the way, including York, and presented their demands to the king. Although Henry appeared to negotiate, even promising a pardon and to pull back on some of the reforms, as soon as the crowds dispersed, he didn't make good on those promises. Instead, he doubled down. The leaders were arrested, and many were executed, including Robert Aske, who had been the movement's figurehead. The Pilgrimage of Grace ultimately failed, but it sent a clear message. Not everyone in England was on board with the new religious order. It revealed just how deep the attachment to traditional Catholic practices really ran, and how disruptive Henry's reforms had been to everyday life, especially in the more conservative north. But despite this resistance, reformers, emboldened by Henry's backing, began pushing for even more radical changes, putting the clergy under growing pressure. In 1538, another set of injunctions was issued. These specifically ordered the removal of religious images and relics, prohibited pilgrimage entirely, and encouraged people to read the Bible and focus on personal piety instead. These weren't just abstract ideas or suggestions this time. They were detailed instructions to take down feigned images, and again it sent a clear message that images should only serve as reminders of saints' lives, never as objects of worship. So, while St George's Day wasn't abolished, the public practices that kept his veneration alive were finally under active assault. Altars, guild chapels, and parish devotions that focused on the saint, especially on his feast day, were dismantled or destroyed. People who had once held these relics and images were now faced with a tough choice: hold on to their faith or risk their lives as the heretics of this new age. In places like St George's Chapel at Windsor and other monastic sites bearing his name, his images were removed or defaced in line with the new directives. Monasteries were shut down, their wealth seized by the crown. Monks were expelled, abbots were executed. Even the shrine to St Edmund at Bury St Edmunds, the once rival to St George, was destroyed. These were not just random acts of destruction, particularly after shows of resistance like we've seen. It was a strategic attempt to tear down the very figures that Catholics and dissenters might rally around. And the dissolution didn't just alter daily religious practices, it fundamentally disrupted the way people observed days like St George's Feast. And yet, as Henry's reign wore on, he seemed to have a change of heart as his stance on religious matters became more conservative. In 1539, the passing of the 6 Articles, famously called the Bloody Whip with 6 strings, went on to reaffirm many of the Catholic doctrines he had once attacked, now making it illegal to challenge them. And so the tables turned very quickly for Protestants who dared to challenge these new laws, risking being burned at the stake for such a crime. With the publication of the King's Book in 1543 and the fall of Thomas Cromwell, the reform's momentum started to stall, and Henry began to backtrack on some of the earlier changes. In this new climate, the push against saintly devotion eased somewhat, with some of the more aggressive measures quietly softened or even abandoned. But even with this retreat, the damage had already been done. The reforms of the 1530s had firmly laid the groundwork for a major decline in saintly devotion, including that of the still patron saint. And this set the stage for even more sweeping changes under Henry's son, Edward VI, when the role of the saints in English religious life would be further forced into retreat. Despite all of this, the old ways didn't simply vanish overnight. They lingered, quietly preserved in half-remembered customs and in corners of the country the reforms hadn't fully managed to reach. Devotion went quiet, yes, but it didn't disappear. That's the thing about suppression. Once it starts, it rarely stays contained. What began as a targeted campaign against images and saints became something much deeper, a kind of spiritual repression that would echo through the Tudor dynasty. The seeds of that chaos were already being sown, and as history so often shows, what gets buried doesn't always stay buried for long. When Edward VI took the throne in 1547, he was just 9 years old. Too young to rule alone, real power passed to the reformist Duke of Somerset and Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, a figure already deeply embedded in the Tudor narrative, and one who had supported Henry VIII's annulment from Catherine of Aragon, as well as being godfather to the young Elizabeth. While Henry had started to chip away at traditional practices, Edward's reign marked a far more ideological and systematic push. Influenced by continental thinkers like Calvin and Zwingli, Cranmer and Somerset steered England in a distinctly Protestant direction, one that went much further than Henry had ever intended. Religious guilds, chantries and brotherhoods, many of which had maintained altars and chapels in St George's name, were shut down under the Chantries Act of 1547. Their assets were seized by the Crown. Their theological foundations, particularly prayers for the dead and belief in purgatory, denounced as, there's that word again, superstition. At the same time, Cranmer approved a new wave of destruction of religious images. What had begun under Henry now took place with a new intensity. Statues, altarpieces, stained glass, anything tied to the old faith was seen as idolatrous and had to be removed, defaced, or destroyed. The energy was fervent, almost revolutionary. Some have even compared this moment to the kind of cultural purges seen centuries later under regimes like Mao's communist China. In a climate like that, saints like St George were no longer safe. While George wasn't officially condemned, he was increasingly sidelined, and his feast day, once a major public celebration, began to lose its place in the calendar. Without the altars, the chapels and the guilds that had supported his cult for centuries, the celebration of St George's Day lost a great deal of its public weight. This change became even more visible in 1549 with the introduction of the first Book of Common Prayer. Written by Cranmer, it marked the moment the mainstream English church truly began to feel Protestant. The Latin Mass was replaced by services in English, holy days were reduced, and St. George's Day left out entirely. For the first time in over 2 centuries, England's national saint was no longer liturgically honoured. A revision came in 1552, and this time George's name did appear, but only as a black letter day, listed in the calendar, but without formal service attached. It was a small nod to tradition, likely a way to ease public concern over how quickly everything was changing. But even then, it was undeniable. The old saints were no longer at the heart of English religious life. All the while, Catholic persecution picked up momentum. Under Henry, both Catholics and Protestants had suffered based on the greater of the perceived threats to his power at any given time. But under Edward, the focus narrowed. Catholics who continued to celebrate Mass, venerate saints, or resist reform in any way were now firmly in the government's sights. While fewer people overall were executed compared to Henry's reign, those who did suffer were often targeted specifically for their beliefs. It was during this phase that St. George as a saint and a martyr quietly faded from the spotlight. His image survived, still tied to the crown as we've seen and still part of the Order of the Garter, but the deeper traditions around him, processions, devotions, prayers, were all falling away. He was no longer a religious figure for the people, he was becoming something else. But things were about to change once more. This Protestant revolution wouldn't last. Just 6 years into his reign, at 15 years old, Edward died, opening the door to a dramatic reversal. His half-sister Mary, a committed Catholic, would soon take the throne. Where Edward had dismantled Catholic tradition, Mary would seek to restore it, forcefully and without compromise. Her reign marked not just a return to Rome, but the beginning of a turbulent era of religious backlash, shaped by the rivalry of 2 half-sisters with 2 very different visions for England's future. And in the struggle between those 2 worlds, the fate of St. George and what he represented for the people would once again hang in the balance. When Mary Tudor took the throne in 1553, England's religious course once again took an even harder turn. A devout Catholic from childhood, Mary saw it as her God-given duty to undo the Protestant reforms of her father, Henry VIII, and her half-brother, Edward VI. Within months of her rule, the break with Rome was reversed. Papal authority was restored, and the English Church was once again placed firmly under the control of Rome. Mary's religious programme reintroduced the Latin Mass, revived the use of relics and images in worship, and brought back many of the feast days and traditions that had been stripped away. Pilgrimage was once again encouraged, saints returned to public devotion, and for a brief moment, St. George returned with them. The revival of St. George's Day under Mary was not dramatic, but it was meaningful. Celebrations resumed at court. Mass was held at Whitehall, with the ceremonial presence of the Knights of the Garter. Across the country, religious guilds, once linked to saints like George, were reinstated, and his feast day was restored in the liturgical calendar. The cult of St. George flickered back to life. Short-lived, yes, but symbolically powerful. A quiet reassertion of the older order Mary was trying so hard to reclaim. But for Mary, restoring Catholicism wasn't just about tradition and re-establishing the old ways. It was about righting a wrong. Alongside her father's break with Rome, she'd also watched her mother, Catherine of Aragon, publicly cast aside, the marriage annulled, her status stripped away. To Mary, the Protestant takeover wasn't just heresy, it was a betrayal of her mother, of her faith, and of her own claim to legitimacy. This wasn't just a restoration, it was a reckoning. Mary's religious restoration was accompanied by one of the most infamous periods of persecution in Tudor England. With the return of heresy laws, Protestants who refused to renounce their beliefs were tried and executed, most often by burning at the stake. Between 1555 and 1558, nearly 300 Protestants were executed under her rule, including prominent figures like Thomas Cranmer, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, and Bishops Nicholas Ridley and Hugh Latimer, who were famously burned together in Oxford. These executions were highly public, intended as a warning, but they would have the opposite effect. They went on to create a wave of Protestant sympathy and martyrdom, immortalised in John Foxe's Book of Martyrs from 1563, which would help shape Protestant identity and cement Mary's legacy as Bloody Mary. Though she intended to restore unity through faith, the sheer scale and spectacle of the burnings contributed to even deeper divisions. Mary's persecution was not unique. Every Tudor monarch engaged in some form of religious suppression, but it was particularly intense, focused, and visible, leaving a deep mark on the national memory. So, while it's tempting to view Mary's regime as a bloody exception, in truth, persecution ran through the entire Tudor period. What shifted was merely the extent and direction of that persecution. Catholics under Edward, Protestants under Mary, and, again, Catholics under Elizabeth. England's national identity, once shaped by the saints, was now being forged through cycles of repression and retaliation. But Mary's reign, like her brothers, was also short-lived. Just 5 years after seizing the crown, Mary died without an heir, and her successor, half-sister Elizabeth I, would once again reverse the country's religious course, perhaps more moderately but no less decisively. The revival of saintly cults, including the brief resurgence of St. George's Day, would once again slide into decline as Protestantism reasserted itself under a new monarch. When Elizabeth I took the throne in 1558, England was a nation once again at a religious crossroads. The brief but fiery Catholic restoration under her sister Mary had left the country fractured and uncertain. But Elizabeth, more aligned with her father Henry VIII than with either of her siblings, moved quickly to re-establish Protestantism. Her approach was more measured than Edward's radicalism or Mary's rigid restoration. What emerged was something more cautious, more political, a balancing act known as the Elizabethan religious settlement. Elizabeth's religious reforms were as much about keeping the peace as they were about doctrine. Through the Act of Uniformity and the revised Book of Common Prayer from 1559, she once again broke decisively with Rome while attempting to preserve just enough tradition to keep the uneasy peace. While Elizabeth's reign saw the Church of England firmly established, it was dressed in compromise. Protestant in theology, Catholic in aesthetic. This so-called middle way aimed to calm both sides. Moderate Catholics were offered enough continuity to stay quiet, while Protestants had their break from Rome officially confirmed. But not everyone was convinced. With the growing Protestant ethos, Catholic saints' days were increasingly viewed with suspicion. Even after Mary's attempts to restore the traditions, these once central celebrations were pushed even further into the margins. St. George's Day was once again a telling case. Restored under Mary as a red-letter day, it initially kept that symbolic status under Elizabeth as well. By preserving the feast of England's patron saint, Elizabeth nodded to continuity and national pride, even as the Church moved further from its Catholic roots. But by 1561, St. George's Day had been quietly demoted. It became a black-letter day once more, still on the calendar, but no longer marked with formal religious observance. The Church of England was beginning to distance itself from saints' cults, even when those saints carried George's level of patriotic weight. Once again for St. George, the Church was sending a message. Theological devotion was out, and symbolic heritage was the new order of the day. But even as Elizabeth's reforms tried to walk a middle line, they sparked resistance on both sides. Catholics, especially after the Pope excommunicated Elizabeth in 1570, were increasingly treated with suspicion. Recusants, those who refused to attend Anglican services, were fined, imprisoned, or worse. Jesuit missionaries were seen as foreign agents, and over the course of Elizabeth's reign, around 200 Catholics were executed, many accused of treason simply for practicing their faith. And at the same time, Puritans, radical Protestants, argued that her reforms didn't go far enough. They wanted to purge every last trace of Catholic influence. No vestments, no bishops, no saints, no compromise. While Elizabeth pushed back against their more extreme demands, the Puritan movement continued to grow underground, especially in universities and urban centres, laying much of the groundwork for future upheaval. So what became of St. George in this time? No longer a focal point of liturgical life, he slipped into a kind of symbolic limbo, still tied to England's identity, still honoured in pageantry and monarchy, but increasingly disconnected from the rhythms of everyday religious life. This quiet demotion reflected a larger trend. Saints had long been fading from public devotion, even as their cultural memory remained. The rituals might have gone, but for the people the meaning stayed behind, carried in songs, in stories, and in humble traditions. And perhaps most of all, in a kind of collective longing for a spiritual world that had been stripped of its once familiar patterns. Elizabeth's reign brought outward stability, but it deepened the wounds of the past. For Protestants, it was a triumph of reform and the founding of a new Church of England. For Catholics, it was a time of suppression and fear. And for the wider English public, it was yet another time of upheaval in a long and exhausting tug-of-war. The Tudor period was not merely a time of religious reform as we've seen, but a dynasty of recurring repression, each reign attempting to erase or override the religious and cultural impulses of the last. The public and private tensions created by these cycles of enforcement gave rise to what we might describe in psychological terms as a kind of return of the repressed. Those suppressed religious instincts and identities, when denied open expression, often resurface with renewed force, sometimes in devotion, and as we've seen, sometimes in defiance. The cult of saints, once central to English piety, was no longer valued by the institutions that once sustained it. St. George remained a symbol, but no longer a focus of worship. His story, like so much of England's sacred tradition, had been repurposed to serve the state, but his cultural memory would live on, waiting to resurface in unexpected ways. When Elizabeth died in 1603, the Tudor era ended, and with it, one of the most turbulent chapters in English religious life. Her successor, James VI of Scotland, would inherit not just the crown, but the unresolved tensions of a country still haunted by the saints and the people it had silenced. When James ascended to the throne in 1603 to become James I, he united the crowns of England and Scotland. England entered a new phase of its national story. The Reformation had already stripped many saints of their religious stature, and St. George was already undergoing transformation. But by the early 17th century, his saintly image was transforming into something more distanced from his original personality. In 1604, just 1 year into his reign, James I declared himself King of Great Britain. Parliament refused to formally recognise the title, but James was insistent on including it in official proclamations, coinage, and correspondence. He had a clear vision: one monarchy, one people, one identity, and James worked hard to give that vision shape. He wanted to give this new concept of a British identity a recognisable form, so James commissioned the creation of the Union flag in 1606. It combined the red cross of St. George with the white saltire of St. Andrew, the patron saint of Scotland. Though the union of crowns wasn't a political union, the two kingdoms still had separate parliaments and laws. The new flag symbolised the personal union under one monarch. St. George's cross didn't disappear. It was still flown from English ships and used in many local and royal settings, but it now shared space within a new vision of unity. The saint was no longer just a religious figure, or even just England's champion. He was being woven into something larger, a symbol of royal power as part of the emerging British identity. While James styled himself as a unifier, the religious divides were, however, still very real. Many English Catholics had hoped James, son of the Catholic Mary Queen of Scots, might ease the repression they'd suffered under Elizabeth, but that hope quickly faded. Recusancy fines were raised, Catholic priests were banned, laws prohibited Catholics from holding public office or even owning weapons, and then in 1605 came the Gunpowder Plot, a failed attempt by a group of Catholic conspirators to blow up Parliament and assassinate the king. They had a clear aim to end Protestant rule and spark a Catholic uprising. The discovery of the plot led to brutal executions and even harsher crackdowns on Catholics. With all of this going on, saints like St. George lost even more of what little religious function remained. His feast day was still retained, but more as tradition than devotion. By this time, the church had moved on. As such, by now, St. George's Day itself was more about state ceremony than spiritual ritual. It lived on in institutions like the Order of the Garter once more, which James and his son Charles I both upheld as a symbol of honour, chivalry, and continuity of royal legitimacy. Meanwhile, a new threat to old traditions was rising. The Puritan movement, already growing in Elizabeth's final years, gained traction under James. They wanted a church stripped of ceremony, hierarchy, and saints altogether. In fact, some had already had enough at this point, having left for pastures new. And at the Hampton Court Conference in 1604, Puritan leaders pushed James to adopt their reforms, but the king resisted, famously declaring, "No bishop, no king." For James, purifying the church meant weakening the crown. Still, the pressure from reformers didn't go away. It grew, and by the time Charles I inherited the throne, the tension had become something much more volatile. Under Charles, the divide deepened. Royalists leaned heavily on traditional symbols, monarchy, divine right, and figures like St. George, as markers of authority and legitimacy. Opposing parliamentarians, many aligned with Puritan ideals, saw those same symbols as remnants of a corrupt and unholy order. When the English Civil War broke out in 1642, those symbols became battle lines, not just metaphors, but literal banners raised in conflict. In the chaos of the war, St. George had become a cultural flashpoint, claimed by monarchs, questioned by reformers, and all the while quietly remembered by the people who'd yet to forget. He survived not because of liturgy, but because he meant something. He was continuity in a world constantly losing its footing, a thread tying the present to the past, even if no one quite agreed on where the future should lead. When the English Civil War erupted, it marked a dramatic shift for English society. More than a battle for power, it brought the country into cultural turmoil. In 1649, the monarchy was abolished, and with it, the royal patronage of St. George's Day. The Order of the Garter's celebrations, once a grand affair, had been suspended. The monarchy's symbols were swept aside as England grappled with a new identity. The ceremonies that celebrated England's patron saint were silenced, as the nation turned its back on royal traditions. Under the Puritan-led Commonwealth, between 1649 and 1660, religious celebrations in general were dramatically reduced. The 1645 Directory for the Public Worship of God replaced the Book of Common Prayer, eliminating all saints' days, including St. George's Day. By 1650, after already banning Easter and Christmas 3 years earlier, the Rump Parliament passed further legislation, explicitly prohibiting their observance. This sweeping purge of ritual and festivity reflected the Puritans' deep rejection not only of what they considered lingering pagan customs, but also what they viewed as unbiblical Catholic traditions. At the helm of this religious and political transformation was Oliver Cromwell, a distant relative of the earlier Thomas Cromwell, and a figure whose Puritan vision sought to strip England of excess rituals and bring it closer to a direct relationship with the Bible. Under his leadership, the celebration of St. George's Day and many other feasts became relics of a past that no longer aligned with the new vision of England. Though Cromwell's government never formally abolished the Order of the Garter itself, the institution became inactive, and for the first time, St. George's connection to the leadership of the country was severed. Without the church, and without royal authority, he was a knight no more. The cultural fabric of England, once held together by its shared rituals, now unravelled as the nation struggled with its identity in the absence of monarchy and in the absence of the symbolic power of saints. After Oliver Cromwell's death in 1658, the tight grip of Puritan control began to loosen. His son, Richard Cromwell, stepped into his father's role as Lord Protector, but he didn't carry the same authority or the same fearsome presence. Without Oliver's leadership, the ideological force behind the Commonwealth began to falter, and with that came subtle but telling changes. Laws banning saints' days and traditional feasts were still technically in place, but fewer people were enforcing them. In towns and villages, especially in the more rural areas, people began to quietly revive old customs. By Christmas of 1658, just months after Cromwell's death, England was quietly but unmistakably celebrating again. Despite the official bans, families were decorating their homes, exchanging gifts, and gathering in ways that hadn't been seen openly in years. It wasn't a full return, not yet, but it was a flicker of what had been and what would come again. This quiet cultural pushback spoke to something brewing below the surface, a growing desire for restoration. Of the monarchy, yes, but also of a more familiar, more festive way of life, rooted in shared rituals, old customs, and the comforting rhythms of the yearly calendar. In the background, the third and final wave of Puritan migration was already underway, smaller than those that came before, but telling all the same. Like the early separatists, who had once grown disillusioned with the slow pace of reform under Elizabeth, many now chose to leave, seeking new lands where their vision could survive intact, uncompromised by the changing tide. Because soon that tide would turn completely. We'll explore that part of the story in the next video. But to close out, what can we take away from this chapter? The English Civil War and the short-lived Republic under Cromwell were more than power struggles. They were theological and symbolic crises, masquerading as constitutional ones. And more pressingly, the question wasn't simply who should rule. It was, what does legitimate authority even look like when the king no longer seems ordained by God and the church no longer seems to speak for him? That's why, for the Puritans, it wasn't enough to remove a monarch. They had to remove the very symbols that conferred legitimacy. Saints' days, the Book of Common Prayer, Christmas, even the monarchy itself. In a sense, the Republic was an attempt to reboot the entire symbolic order, to purify the space of public life from corrupt or illegitimate intermediaries as they saw them. And that's exactly the logic that many of the Puritans who left for America took with them. They weren't just leaving for more religious freedom. They were trying to construct a new society in which only God's authority would be recognised. No bishops, no popes, no kings, just scripture, conscience, and covenant. From the medieval period through to Cromwell's dissolution of the monarchy, we've seen a clear decline in the veneration of St. George, not only as a heavenly intercessor, but as a symbol of royal power and national identity. Thanks to his unusually flexible personality, he lasted longer than many other saints or symbols. But even he reached a low point during a time when the monarchy was abolished and saints were quite literally banned by law. As you can imagine, this wasn't the end for a plucky saint. But if we zoom out and take a broader view of the changes he weathered, a larger story begins to emerge, one that touches on history, but even more than that, on how England came to understand itself. Because the decline of St. George was not an isolated event. It was part of a more foundational coming apart at the seams, not just of religion or monarchy, but the entire emotional framework that had held England together for centuries. Take the Reformation. One of the clearest threads running from the Lollards to the Puritans is this movement of meaning, away from outer institutions and towards inner conviction. Each of these movements, the Lollards, the Humanists, the Reformers and the Puritans, in their own way pushed against the inherited scaffolding of ritual, monarchy and church hierarchy. The Lollards challenged the church's monopoly on truth, promoted vernacular scripture and questioned the validity of hollow rituals. They put the Bible into the hands of the people, literally. The Humanists weren't heretics, but they shifted the focus to reason, ethics and classical learning. They emphasized the individual's capacity for moral responsibility and thoughtful engagement. The Reformers made the break explicit. Salvation didn't come through ritual, but through faith. No more priest as mediator, the conscience was now centre stage. And the Puritans pushed this to its radical conclusion. They stripped the church of ceremony, focused on introspection, and reimagined worship as a deeply personal, morally rigorous discipline. It's clear that these movements all shared something foundational, that desire to strip back distraction, to simplify doctrine, and to get closer to God. In each era, this played out differently, shaped by the political pressures, social tensions, and historical accidents of the time. But seen from above, instead of a series of isolated events, they form a continuous current, each stage handing over more authority from the institution to the individual, from collective pageantry to private belief. So what does this unbroken thread of history tell us about ourselves? If this centuries-long process was about peeling away outer layers to reach something more authentic, then it speaks to something timeless in human nature. These movements didn't just shape a country's religion, they shaped the people's perceptions of themselves. And in doing so, I think they revealed 3 key truths about our search for meaning and identity. 1, we're always searching for meaning that feels real. People rebel when rituals ring hollow, when institutions stop speaking to the heart. Whether in religion, politics, or culture, we crave authenticity. Not just performance, but something that resonates. 2, there's a limit to top-down control. The tighter the grip, whether from a medieval church, a Tudor court, or a modern system, the more pressure builds beneath the surface. The more something is repressed, the more powerfully it returns. That return of the repressed isn't just a Jungian psychological theory, it's a tangible historical pattern. And 3, identity is as psychological as it is political. These religious and political movements were also changes in how people saw themselves, what it meant to be a believer, a subject, a human soul. And when those identities cracked, people searched for the next story, the next myth, the next symbol to hold things together. But transformation always comes at a cost. As we've seen time and again, as the old saints faded, so too did the scaffolding of a shared emotional world. The rituals, the stories, the familiar rhythms of life, all gone. What remained after that was all stripped away was something less sacred and something much more fragile. A nation that had once understood itself through saints and rituals had now set itself up to face the shadow side of reform, not just freedom, but fragmentation, dislocation in the place of the authenticity it sought. And we're seeing echoes of this today. In a secular age where institutions are distrusted and traditional symbols have lost their gravity, the need for ritual, rootedness, and shared meaning hasn't disappeared. It's just been displaced, reimagined. So maybe the deeper force behind all of these movements is this: the need to balance individual conscience with a longing for collective identity, to seek freedom without sacrificing the meaning that only belonging can give. And perhaps one step further, the question of trust, not just in authority itself, but in whether there are still signs that it's grounded in something real. St. George once carried that trust, not always a mere tool of power, but a palpable symbol of something true, something people believed in, and whose meaning came not from decree, but from devotion. Perhaps that's what we began to lose, the ability to tell the difference between authority that serves us and authority that dominates. And in that confusion, we began to tear down even the symbols that still held legitimate power. Even in the silence left behind by saints and monarchs, prophets and parliaments, the story doesn't end here. It waits for new myths, for new names. See you in part 3, where we explore the further challenges to come for St. George and the symbols that rose to take his place.